All right, so today we're gonna continue doing Laravel, and we're gonna look at another pattern for interacting with our database. So before we were using the DB class, which was called the query builder, which felt a lot like SQL. It just wrapped in like PHP functions and methods and objects and all that. But we're gonna look at something that's a little bit more object oriented today, using what's called an ORM or object relational mapping. So before we get into that, I wanted to cover kind of two lab, or actually just well, you have two labs tonight. One I'll kind of explain at the end because it's pertinent to what we go over today in class, and then the other is the final project proposal. So I posted the final project requirements. It's at the top of the page, so you can click it. And there's two parts. There's a Laravel part, which is part one, and then part two is a Node API, which we'll get into when we dive into the JavaScript portion. But you're essentially going to design a database on anything really that you want. So you can make this website on just whatever topic interests you, and you'll design the database, and then you'll create a Laravel app that interacts with that database, and then you'll also create a Node API that interacts with that database. So they'll both kind of do touching the same thing. So the requirements are pretty general. It's just using certain things that we learned in this class, but it's kind of open-ended in terms of what you want to build. So go ahead and take a look at those later. I left part three TBD just because I need to fill that in still. I need to think about it a little bit more. And I gave some options just because there's a few other things that we'll learn towards later in the class. So if you want to use them, you can. So one of them is we'll learn a little bit about WebSockets in Node, which is like having real-time capabilities in your app. So if you want to add that into your app, you can, and then you can do like two less API endpoints in Node just to make up for the work. And we'll also have a guest lecture on NoSQL. We've been using SQLite, which is a relational database. NoSQL is a non-relational database. So we'll learn a little bit about that. It is towards the end of the semester, so it is a little bit risky. Let me open up the syllabus. Right, so the NoSQL database is kind of towards the end, so you wouldn't want to wait until like the last couple weeks to start working on your project. So if anything, it might be something in addition to, just or if you want to start looking at it early. But the option's there because people have asked me in the past, like, hey, can we use it? So just letting you know. Okay, and kind of like with all the homeworks, you'll submit a repo along with the deployed Laravel and Node APIs, so you can click through it, and then also a screencast walking me through every requirement that you fulfill. So it's your chance to kind of just explain yourself, since it's easy for me to miss something as I'm kind of going through your app and stuff. So any questions? Okay, so one of the labs is a project proposal. It's not due next week, so note the due date. It's due 2/19, so I gave you a couple weeks to do it, so you can think about it. You don't have to just come up with an idea in 7 days. You'll essentially just kind of talk about what problem are you trying to solve, who is the audience, and how are you going to fulfill certain requirements. I gave a couple ideas from projects last semester, so I picked out a few. These have working URLs, so they were hosted on Heroku, and then you can actually click through them, and here's a quick little description. So you can get an idea of what some people did. And for this, just create a Google Doc titled this, but replace your first name and last name with your actual name, and then just share that with me and Finn, and then that's good. So you don't have to create like a Microsoft Word doc or anything. Just do it in Google Docs, please. Any questions? Okay, so that's one lab, and then you'll also have a lab on Laravel stuff that we covered today, and that is due next week. Okay, so today we're going to look at object relational mapping. The acronym is ORM, and these sets of slides are going to obviously cover it in Laravel's ORM called Eloquent, but there's other ORMs out there which we'll kind of learn towards the end. Okay, so what is an ORM? So if you think about your database, you typically have a relational database, and you might have a table like tracks. But then you have your object-oriented code, and then how do you map the records in your database to your objects in your code base? And that's essentially what an ORM does. It kind of maps the records in a tracks table, and each record in the track table or tracks table would become a track object that we define in our code base. So it's kind of mapping just the records, one record to one class, and which turns into an object. Okay, so a quick example of what would this look like if we wanted to create a new song record in a tracks table. Or let's see, no, if we wanted to create a new track, sorry. So typically, if we were using like the query builder, we would use something like db : tracks insert, and then insert a bunch of data. In this case, we can think of it more like an object. So we'll create this class called track. We'll assign a few properties, and then we can call track save, and this would actually do the insert. So you don't really see like SQL-like language here. It's treating it more just like high-level objects. If I wanted to associate a track with an artist, I could find the artist. So this artist equals artist find 3. So find the one with an ID of 3, and then and call it a method called associate to associate the two with it, which would kind of create this the relationship between the two. So if you look at this, it looks very much like more like object-oriented code and how you would talk about it probably, as opposed to like low-level SQL language. So you don't see anything about like where clauses or db : table. You don't. This is all kind of just happening behind the scenes. All right. So what are the advantages to this? So I think initially when you get started, there is a little bit of a learning curve because it's another way of thinking about it. But once you do learn it, it becomes very rapid to start developing applications. You don't have to think about the low-level like data access code, so you don't have to think about like which columns am I going to select, which joins do I have to do. You're just thinking in terms of objects, and so it does become, I think, in my opinion, quicker once you do get familiar with like this style of interacting with databases. So you don't really have to write SQL, but you do need to understand SQL because in the end, it's still generating SQL behind the scenes. And well, I'll get to it later. Okay, so here's kind of another example. How would I, find? I want to update song that has an ID of 5 in the songs table. So what I could do is I could find the song. So I can say song : find 5, and that's the ID 5. This will give me back a song object. I can just change the different properties which correspond to the column. So there might be like a title column and a price column. I could set these properties to new values and then call save. And this is like the equivalent of doing an update statement in SQL, but just in a shorter, fewer lines, I guess. You don't have to think about like PDO and binding the params and any of that. It's this is taken care of behind the scenes. Okay, so I thought we could do some exercises together against the database that we've been working with. So in Laravel, we can actually create models using this command. So php artisan make : model, and then give it the name of the class. And then there's this other command called php artisan tinker, and this allows us to actually just like tinker around in like a console without having to like boot up the application like in a browser. So it's a really good way to like play around. So if you want to cd into the directory that we've been working with, so right now I'm inside my ITP tunes class directory, so everything we've been doing in the past couple weeks. And I'm going to run this first command, so php artisan make model. So php artisan make model artist. And if we look at our database schema, the name of the model that we're creating is the singular version of a table. So we could create models for tracks, but it would be called track. We can create a model called artist, genre, media type, and so on. So it's just the singular of the table name. So I'll hit enter. And then I'll go ahead and boot up Atom just so I can start modifying the code. And this will have created this file called artist.php in that app directory. So if you look at it, oops. It's essentially just an empty class that extends from this Eloquent model class called model. And this gives us all the behavior without us really even having to do much. So just this by itself gives us so much behavior that without us having to write custom code. Okay, so I'm gonna clear frequently just to move to the top of the screen. So if you need me to send a command or something in Slack, let me know. Okay, so if I go in here and say PHP Artisan Tinker, this is gonna boot up like a little console for us to write PHP code in, and our application is actually loaded into this, so I can start interacting with it here. So one thing I can do is, if we look at the class, so the class name is artist, and then the namespace is app. So I can actually do app/artist, and because it's extending from Eloquent model, we can actually, we already have a bunch of methods accessible to us. So I can say all, and this will have queried for all the records in the artist table. So this is like the equivalent of saying select star from artist. Oh, sure. Oh, for this the slash? Yeah, when you have a namespace, that's how the namespaces work. Yeah, we haven't. I guess all the classes we've used have been like DB and stuff, and validator, which have been global. So we just had to say that. So yes, if you have like a namespace, it's this. Is this /? I always forget, but it's this slash. This is backslash. So we could actually, if we wanted to, I could say use app/artist, and then I can say artist : all. And this will allow me to use that artist class because I said use app/artist. So just by creating that class, I'm able to query for it in one single line, which is really handy. And so behind the scenes, Laravel is doing that select star from artist, and then it's looping through every single one of those records and creating a new instance of this artist class with those properties that correspond to the columns that we selected. So in this case, that's why when we look at this output, we can see the name of the class, and then here are the properties, which are the corresponding column names, so artist ID and name.
So have these like objects, I guess, or have these already been created, like, and it's just showing it to us, or is it like when you hit enter on that all command, then it created it?
Yes, it did the select statement and then looped through all of them and created new artist instances for each result that was returned from the database, and then that's what we're seeing. Yeah. Okay, so there's also another one where we could say artist : find and then pass it the ID. So in this case, let's just pick the last one, so ID 275. So I could say 275, and this is like the equivalent of saying select star from artist where artist ID is equal to 275. But if I run this, I'm actually going to get an error, and the reason for this is Eloquent actually has certain conventions that it follows to query the database, and one of those conventions is having the primary key called ID, not artist ID. Right, so behind the scenes, it's doing something like this. Select star from artist where ID is equal to 275. But our primary key is artist ID, not ID. So how can we change that? So typically, if I'm creating a database, I would just follow the conventions because those are probably pretty common, and it just makes things easier. But since I found this free database and I had a lot of data and I didn't really want to go through and like change all the columns and stuff, it's a lot of work. We can Eloquent is flexible enough so we can actually configure it to say, hey, the primary key is artist ID and not ID. So inside this class, I can say protected $primary key, and we're going to set it equal to artist ID. So then Laravel will kind of see that we've declared this property in our class and then use this instead of ID. Yes?
So for these, you're going to have to be very exact about like capitalization and stuff. Like,
yeah.
Calling it, like, it has to be correct, otherwise like it's not going to be able to figure out what you're trying to say.
Exactly. Which is kind of good because at least when we're learning an ORM, if you know it follows these conventions, but if you don't know what those conventions are, it feels a little magical. So now you're kind of being told up front like what these conventions are. So then if you do go for your final project and you want to make a database that follows like the Laravel conventions, which I'd probably recommend, then you kind of know what's going on under the hood and it feels less magical. Okay, so now if I kind of go back and rerun this, we're still going to get the error. It's because PHP Artisan Tinker, I don't think, reloads it. So I just do Control-C and then rerun PHP Artisan Tinker. And then I'm going to do app/artist, find 275. And you can see now we get back that artist. Any questions? So we know how to find all artists. We know how to find a single artist. Now let's kind of go through creating and updating and deleting them too. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an artist. So I'm going to create a new variable. Well, actually, I'm going to say use app/artist, just so I don't have to type it out a bunch of times. And then I can say, I'll say artist is equal to new artist. So I'll just create a new instance of it. Now this, by saying new artist, it doesn't actually do the insert right then. This just kind of creates an object in memory, but it's not written to the database yet. So now I could say artist arrow and then point to the column name. So in this case, it's called capital N name. So I'll say name is equal to all right. And so at this point, it still hasn't written it. And now I could say artist arrow save. Ah, yes. Okay, I forgot about this convention too. Um, okay, so it failed to save, and it's because our table actually has no updated at column or created at. And so also another convention that Laravel has is in all of the tables, they create columns, or if you put columns called updated at and created at in there, it'll contain timestamps. So every time you do an insert, it'll update the created at. Every time you modify the record, it'll update the updated at. So you always have a timestamp of like when this data is modified. But as you can see, this table actually doesn't have those columns. So now we have to look it up because I forgot. Oh yeah. Okay, so it looks like public timestamps false. So it is a really handy feature to have. Okay, so I'm gonna go back here, and I kind of have to reload this. Let me actually do this back at the top. Okay. Okay, so let me do that again. So I'm going to say use app/artist. Then I'll say artist is equal to new artist. And then I'll say artist arrow name. And now if I do artist arrow save, it returns back true, meaning that it was successful. And one interesting thing to note here now is typically when you do like an insert into a database, what usually automatically gets created? Yeah, an ID. And so now if I actually do artist arrow artist ID, you can see that it has 276. Remember the last one we did was 275. So it did like auto create that and set that as a property on this artist variable or object. Yes.
Can you go back to that as well?
Here?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And that was the one you need to add in order
To tell it, yeah, the primary key is this instead of it being this.
I missed the second one.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is to ignore the like the updated at and created at columns. By the way, most frameworks have this style of ORM. There's like a couple different versions, and this is called like the active record pattern. And so if you do end up working in like Rails or some other frameworks, you'll see this same type of thing. Okay, so we did an artist. We created a brand new artist. So this did like an insert SQL statement. So let's modify this artist and update it. So now we can actually just take this same exact object and we can give it a new name. And me writing this, I haven't actually done the update statement yet, but now I can say just call save again. And this will do the update. So I didn't even have to think about like an first finding it and then updating it. I could just take that same artist variable, reassign the name property just like any other variable, and then just call save, and then this rewrote it to the database. So now if I actually went and said artist : find 276, so this will just do select star where artist ID equals 276. You can see that it did do the update. So that's reading, creating, and updating. So what do you think deleting would look like? Pretty much, yeah. So I could say artist, arrow. I forget if it's delete or yeah, it's delete. So now if I actually did artist colon find 276 null, so it doesn't exist in the database anymore. Yes.
How would you like, I guess, revert? Because like before you update it, right? Before it actually updates, you have to hit like save, right? Artist save.
Mm-hmm.
So what if you decide before you save, you're like, oh wait, I don't want to change that, and then you want to change it back, or yeah, something like that.
Like in a single request.
Yeah, or even like in a string, I guess. Just because like I just tried to create. I created a variable in artist called like I don't know third variable or something, which doesn't exist in the table.
Oh.
When I tried to save it, it's like, hey, you can't do that because there's no column.
Oh yeah.
That name. So like, how would I get rid of that third variable that I just tried to add?
Oh, I see. Okay. That or you wouldn't put those things on the artist. Like you'd put it somewhere else, but you wouldn't store like that type of like state or anything on the artist because that's really meant to like persist back to the database. So like if you're putting it on there, you just put in another variable. There might be a way around that too, but I like feels like an anti-pattern, but
yeah.
Would it work if you made it like null or something?
Probably, yeah, that too. But actually I don't know. Yeah, maybe if you like behind the scenes, it's looping over every single property and it sees ones that don't match the columns, like then it just throws an error. So probably you just want to keep it restricted just to like database columns.
Right.
Do you not have to specify anything in the delete because of the previous commands, or like how does it know to grab 276?
Yeah. So this artist right here was the same one that we first created, and then we updated the same thing. So behind the scenes, it already had like the ID.
Okay.
Yeah, and so so now actually, I think if we just did artist, right, like it's still an object in memory, but when I tried to find it, like requery for the database, it doesn't exist, but it's still like in memory here. But yeah, this was it already knew about like the ID, which was this. Yes.
Would you want to update something that you didn't make yourself, like that was already in the database, and like if you wanted to update 275, for example?
If I want to update artist 275, like update its name.
Or like yeah, the ID, or yeah, update the artist whose ID is 275, because we don't have that like our own created variable to reference anymore.
Oh, we could say like artist is equal to artist : find 275. This will give us this one, and then we could do the same thing. We could say artist arrow name equals something else, and then recall save. Any other questions? Okay, so we just went through all the standard CRUD operations, which are create, read, which is select, update, which is editing, and then deleting. So kind of the main operations against records. And all we really had to do was create this class, and only because our database didn't really follow the conventions Laravel expects, we had to add these couple extra things. But if we follow those conventions, we wouldn't have had to add these properties. Okay, so those are like the basics of working with an ORM. Now it gets into like the fun part, which is like relationships. So this is where it gets a little bit harder. Okay, so just to kind of review relationships in databases. Okay, so a very common one is the one-to-many relationship. So if you think about like artists and songs, our database, they call it tracks, but an artist can have many songs, right? So here's like the infinity for the many. Each song will have this foreign key called artist ID, which is, these two tables are following like the Laravel conventions, which is also just like the common conventions even outside Laravel too. So the primary keys are called just ID, and these two match up to each other, so we can relate the two. So in this case, you could say an artist has many songs. Any questions? Okay, so how would we define the relationship in our ORM so that we could access the songs from an artist object? So what we can do here is we can say class artist. So this is just like the regular definition, but we can create a function called songs, and we can say return this has many of what. And in this case, it's the class, the fully qualified class name, which is app/song. And it has many because the artist has many songs. So in this case, with this little bit of code, we could say, let's find artist 5. And then from here, I can say artist arrow songs, and this will give me a collection or an array of all the songs for this given artist. So the SQL that's sort of being, that's generated behind the scenes is the first find the artist for that given ID. So it's select star from artist, where the artist ID is 5. So let me find that first song, or first artist. And then from there, I can say select star from songs, where the songs.artist ID is equal to 5. So these two PHP lines would translate into these two SQL statements. Certain ORMs might do it a little bit differently, so it really depends. I just did some logging on the on Eloquent when I ran this, and I saw that these two were the SQL statements being run. So, just kind of interesting to know. Yes.
So you don't have to call it as a function. You can just call it.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, we declared this as a function, right, or a method, and we said arrow songs. I don't know exactly how Eloquent's doing this behind the scenes, but yes, we access it as a property just like the other column names. So, and then this gives us the array. If we actually call it with parentheses, it does something different, so it doesn't work. It's used for like more, I guess, like advanced cases, you could say. But yeah, good thing to note. You don't use parentheses here. Any questions? Okay, so we just looked at the relationship from the artist perspective. So an artist has many songs. Now, if you look at it from the other table's perspective, you could say a song belongs to an artist. So you can see the one with a foreign key, which is artist ID. It belongs to a single artist. In this case, we're just going to say, hey, once a song belongs to only a single artist, even though like as we've seen like on Spotify or whatever, you can see like a song has multiple artists. But just for the sake of like this example, and in our database too, we'll just say a song belongs to a single artist. So these are like the two type of languages you'll see: has many and belongs to. And this is for the one-to-many type of relationship. Okay, so what would this look like? So okay, so in my song class, I can say this is just like the default Eloquent model. It extends model. I'll create the function called artist, but instead of saying has many, I'll say return this belongs to app/artist. So this is how we're going to create that relationship. Now, as we saw with like the conventions, Laravel expects timestamps and a primary key to be called just ID. And there's also some conventions built into this relationship stuff. So if we kind of go back to here, we've already taken care of like the primary key part, but like the foreign key, right? This is used to relate to tables in SQL. And the convention is the singular of the first of the table it relates to _ID. But as we see in our own schema, it's actually things like genre ID, right? So it doesn't really follow the conventions. But Eloquent is flexible, so we can reconfigure this. So what does that look like? So that's kind of what this node is here. Foreign key should be singular, lowercase table name plus underscore ID. There's a way to configure it, and we'll get into it when we dive into the examples. Okay, so if say I wanted to access, maybe I pulled 5 songs onto my homepage, the top 5 or whatever. So I could say song take 5 get. This will query for. This will essentially do select star from songs limit 5. So give me just like the top 5. Then I might have a for loop or a for each loop, and for each one I can just print out the artist of each song. This might actually be, maybe it's something in your template, like your Blade template. You're just looping over the songs to display them, and then you want to access the artist. So what would this do? So behind the scenes, it's going to do this first statement to get to get all the songs, and then as I'm looping through it, it's going to dynamically run this SQL statement to get the associated artist for this song. So it's going to run for 5 times select star from artist, where ID is equal to that artist ID for that given song. So it's populating the artist when you access it. So on demand, or sometimes called lazy loading. So essentially what we've done here is n+1 queries. So the one query is here, so the first one to get all 5 songs, but then as I access the artist of each song, because there's 5 songs, it's going to run this second statement n times, or however many songs there are. So it's n+1 queries. So for 5 songs on a homepage, it's probably fine unless you have like a really high traffic site. But you can imagine if you have a list, like the invoices page that we did, right? And we displayed every invoice. But if I accessed related things from every invoice in my template, in my query, it could potentially trigger a SQL query for related data, and then for one single page, I could have thousands of queries, which could be really bad if I'm a high traffic site and that's a lot of load on the database. And so you might hear this thing like death by 1,000 queries, just because we didn't intentionally try and take down our database or anything, or run so many queries, but just by using the ORM, we just said, it's really easy to grab 5 songs, and then for each one I want to grab its artist. Cool. We didn't unintentionally, though, try to run 6 queries here. We were just like, it's probably optimized in the background. So it's easy to kind of run into these situations just by accident, it was unintentional. So in these cases, this n+1 problem, it could potentially execute too many queries on a given page, but maybe not necessarily. So it's just something to watch out for. As a general thing, sometimes fewer queries doesn't always mean faster. You could have one query that's really complicated and big, and that could actually take longer than a couple smaller queries. So it's always a trade-off and something to kind of monitor. So how can we fix this problem? So in this case, with finding the 5 songs and then getting the artist for each one, we can use a process called eager loading. It's also sometimes called hydration, but it's a way of saying, when I get all of those songs, those 5 songs, load them up with the artist so that beforehand, as opposed to querying for it when I ask for that artist property. So what would that look like now? So here in Eloquent, I could just say song : with the artist, and then if there's a relationship to genre too, I can load it up with it too. Take 5, get, and so now when I say song arrow artist, it doesn't do an extra query here. It's just doing the one query. So it's just one of those things to kind of I guess be aware of, and when you start working with it, just something to monitor and just know of these 2 different approaches. You could also do eager loading with like has many. So if I want to say, give me a bunch of artists and then give me all of the songs for every single artist, you can do that as well. So it's like an array of arrays sort of thing, where you have each artist or an array of artists, and then for each artist it has multiple songs. But it all comes for free with like this with command, so with and then the relationship. And we'll kind of do examples of this too. So there's a few different, there's a lot of popular ORMs. In Laravel, it's Eloquent. In Ruby on Rails, it's just called Active Record, which the pattern is also called Active Record, I believe. So you might just hear people talk about like, oh, this Active Record style ORM. It's just like the style. I think it's because Rails came out with it first, so they like popularized the name. But so Eloquent and Active Record are like the Active Record style ORMs. There's another PHP framework called Symfony. Propel was like the ORM that they had, and that's also like Active Record. There's also another style of ORMs called the data mapper, and that's what this doctrine is. So if you do continue on in PHP, you might read about it or just hear of, or even if you go into like another technology, you might hear about like data mapper ORMs. It's just like there's these two sort of like competing ones. So Active Record and data mapper, and then when we get into Node, we'll look at Sequelize, which is also like an Active Record style ORM too. Okay, so here's like pros, cons, comments. So ORMs they'll handle like a majority of your database needs. Sometimes if you can't figure out how to do an ORM, just drop down to like the query builder, and then you can just access the data that way. So it's not saying like all the time you need to use Eloquent. I think in general people find it pretty useful once you learn it, and then for very specific queries, just use the query builder. Performance-wise, just kind of be aware of that n+1 problem, just because it's really easy to accidentally run too many queries unintentionally. I think when learning an ORM, especially when you get into like the relationship stuff, it just takes a little bit getting used to, kind of like with object-oriented programming in general too. So maybe in the beginning it's a little slower, but once you get used to it, it's pretty valuable, and you'll find like a lot of places using it, so it's also worth learning, in my opinion. They do abstract away SQL, so you can think about your application in terms of objects instead of like SQL statements. But you still kind of have to have an understanding of SQL in order for like performance is a good reason, just so you can see like how is it running these queries behind the scenes, I think. And you also know like what the Eloquent can and can't do. So if you need to drop to like the query builder, then you can do that as well. Okay, so that's enough slides. I can send these to you if you want. Okay, so let's do another one. Let's do genres and tracks. And given that this is the one-to-many relationship, so multiple tracks can belong to a genre, or a genre has many tracks, and a track belongs to a single genre. So here's that kind of one-to-many relationship. So let's create these relationships in Eloquent in our unconventional database and do some queries. Okay, so from the command line, I'm going to say PHP artisan make model, and we'll create this genre model. And then while we're at it, let's also create one for the track model. So create these inside this app folder. So let's go ahead and open these up. Now, just for, because we know that we're going to need this, we can just copy out this primary key and timestamp stuff to each of these classes. So I'm going to copy this out to the genre, and then I'm going to change the value instead of artist ID. I'm going to make it genre ID. And then I'll do the same for the track class, but I'll change this to track ID. So at this point, we can do like all those main methods that we can, like selecting everything, selecting a single record, creating, updating, and deleting. Okay, so if we go back to the genre class, let's create this relationship between genre and tracks. So a genre has many tracks, and if we look at the schema, we can see like, I think that's what this like little three triangle, arrow triangle thing is, like the many. So we can see genre has many tracks. So here we're going to say public function tracks, and we'll say return this arrow has many, and then we'll give it the class name, which is app/track. Yes. Yeah, this is what we want, because there's the relationship between genre and tracks. Yeah, so we're going to create the function here called track, so that from a genre we'll be able to get all of the associated tracks for that given genre. Yeah. Now, I mentioned before that, remember the convention for foreign keys in Eloquent is it would expect something like genre ID, but ours was called, if we actually look at the tracks table, it's genre ID. So we need to adjust this. So we can adjust this by the second argument to this has many call. So we can say genre ID. If we didn't have like this unconventional database, we could actually just do just this, and it's super clean, but we have to add that one extra line. Okay, so now we'll go and do the reverse in the track class. So we'll go over here, and we'll say public function. And so a track belongs to a single genre. So I'm going to say genre instead of genres. And I'll say return this belongs to app/genre. Now we also have to tell it that same foreign key constraint, so we have to say it, tell it it's genre ID instead of genre_ID. Cool, and that's really all there is to it to set up the relationship between these two tables. So now we can go back to our command line. I'll run php artisan tinker. So you have to reboot this up just to kind of refresh the changes that we made. Okay, so now if I say, well, I'm going to say use app/genre. And I'm also going to say use app/track, just so I don't have to like type out the full namespace. Now I can say, if I do genre : find the one with a primary key or an ID of 3. Okay, so this is metal. Okay, so let's find all the tracks in here. So we could say metal is equal to genre : find 3. And then from metal, I want to get all the associated tracks for this genre. So for this genre, we define this function called tracks. I can say arrow tracks, and I'm leaving off the parentheses just because we're treating it like any other column. Behind the scenes, Laravel like configures all this out. So now if I hit enter, there's actually quite a lot of tracks in this database for metal. Okay, let's look at. You can kind of look through some of these, and you can see like track genre ID is 3. So we know that, like, if you inspected each one, they all have a genre ID of 3.
Yeah, what's with the collapse looking list again?
Oh, down here?
Yeah.
I think it's just because there's so many, it doesn't print them all out to the tinker. Okay, I think this is Metallica. So, okay, so this one has a track ID of 1808. So I'm going to copy that. Try to pick something I somewhat know. So now I could say, let's find it. So I'll say track find 1808. And so here we got like this Metallica song. Now I can do the reverse, and I could say from here, you could save it to an intermediate variable. You don't have to, or maybe I will just for the sake of so I can like preserve it. But I could say okay, nothing else matters is equal to track : find. Whoops. 1808. Cool. Okay, so I have this variable, nothing else matters. And then from here I can say, oh, that's cool. Okay, you can actually like type a variable and hit tab and it auto completes. Then you can say arrow and then genre. So this genre, if we look at this track, we have this track object, we can point to this genre. And if I hit enter, you can see now we have access to the metal genre instance. So we've set up this relationship between the two classes correctly. Now I didn't actually have to save it in like these intermediate variables. I could have said like track : find 1808 arrow genre. So like gives me the same thing. Yes.
So if we're making like a Laravel app like for the say for the project, when you design the database, you're going to want to basically have a method or a function for every foreign key in a table.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, you'll create all these like functions and for every table. But realistically, I mean that doesn't. Yeah, it's only like one line or whatever, and it saves you a lot. Like in your controllers is typically it's like your controllers that's interacting with the database, right? So like that part will lessen than if you had used like the query builder. So. But the main thing, I guess, is make sure you have like all of your foreign keys. They're like table _ ID, and then like the primary key is just ID. Like that'll solve it all. And no like capital. Yeah, this database was kind of weird because it also did like the columns in like uppercase. Yeah, but it's fine. Okay, so I think if I do track : find, there's another one, 78. Okay, Master of Puppets, so another Metallica song. So we can actually, we can change its genre. So right now it's a genre ID of 3, which is metal. Let's just temporarily, we'll change it to a different genre, and then we'll just change it back. So if I do genre find, I'll just, what's in 1? Okay, rock. Close enough. So what we can do now is I can say track. I'll do these in a few separate steps. So I'll say Master of Puppets is equal to track : find 78. And then from here, if I want to say let's change its genre, the way we can do this is we can say I can point to genre, but this time I am using the parentheses, and this is when it's going to do something a little bit differently. And then I can call associate. So I can say let's associate a different genre. So in this case, I want to say let's do genre 1, which is rock, right? Because right now it's genre 3, which is metal. So I can say genre : find 1. So this line right here will just reassign this genre to Master of Puppets, or it'll update it to rock instead of metal. So if I hit enter, you can see that it's now rock.
Is there a way to make it both? Like you're going to put in both categories?
No, because the database isn't set up that way. Yeah, because it's just the track, it's a one-to-many relationship, so a track can really only have one genre. You'd have to architect the database for that. Yes.
So if you're developing, just like using artisan serve, I guess, you're not going to see like this, right? Because in Tinker, it's showing you like where all the changes are being made. Like it even has that one in a different color now because you changed it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But we're not like when you're doing this in the development server, it's not going to be showing that, right? Like you have to assume that it's working. I guess, or just check the database yourself.
Check the database yourself, yeah. I mean, I guess, or like as you're developing, like you'll probably have like a list page, right? And you'll have a create page as you're creating your UI and going through it. You'll just manually check it too. You could also write like unit tests or something for all this, but yeah, that's another thing. All right, so one more example, and this is like the more complicated one, and then we'll end it for today. Okay, so does anyone know kind of what relationship exists between playlists and tracks? Yeah, that's it. Yeah, many to many. Nice. Yeah, so a playlist can have multiple tracks, but then a track can belong to many playlists. And this is kind of like the example you said with genres that you were like, oh, can a track have multiple genres? It would need to be like this many to many relationship, just like what's set up right here. So yeah, you'd have to re-architect the database to look more like these tables. So if we look at this here, we have the playlist table, which looks a lot like the genres table. Then we have the tracks table, which kind of like your regular table has the primary keys in both, and the one that relates the two together is this playlist _ track table. And they typically, does anyone know what they call this type of table? Yeah, join table. So when you have like this many to many relationship, you have like this join table that associates the primary key from the playlist, so playlist ID, and then the track ID from here. And this allows you to create multiple. So like, if we were to do this, right, we have like tracks playlist. We'll say like 1 is A, 2 B. Let's see, 1 Z, 2 Y. Okay, and then so you have this other table here, which is playlist underscore track, and then what this kind of looks like if I wanted to create like track 1 to be in both of these playlists, you could say here's the playlist ID and then the track ID. So I could say, okay, for this track ID, I need to have 2 entries. So actually, okay, so imagine these are like the primary keys. So I can say 1, 1, but then I want it to be in 1 and 2. So I do 1, 2. Now for here, I want to do song 2 to be in both of these playlists. So 1, 2. And so it's essentially combining, creating like, you can think of like the Cartesian product of both of these. And so this is kind of creating that relationship. So this is the join table. This is kind of like what it looks like if you were to inspect it in SQLite. Any questions? Can anyone think of like any other type of many-to-many relationship that you've just like experienced in like apps or just anything you've built or just maybe even visiting sites?
Almost like sign-in pages, like a password and stuff. You have that, or is that many to one?
Typically, well, let's see. It could be maybe. Well, usually you only have one password though, right? Like, unless you have. Yeah, I guess what were you thinking?
Well, because I just remember like in my last class, I was trying to do that, and he mentioned like a mini type of relationship. So maybe he was just talking about many to one.
Oh, okay. I guess it depends maybe on the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You do like users to subreddits, or like users to subscribe to forums.
Oh yeah. So yeah. Because a user could subscribe to many subreddits, but then that would also have many users. Yeah. There's a. Yeah. Because a book could have multiple authors. Yeah. You could also see like blog posts and tags. So a blog post can have many tags, but then the tag can have many posts.
If you were going to model that in a database, you have to have this sort of intermediary join tip.
Yeah, this is the only way I know how to do it. Maybe there's another way, but I think this is like the common way to do it. Okay, so what we can do now is we're going to set up our models to handle this relationship. So we're actually going to create a model for track, a model for playlist, and we won't need a model for this. We'll just set up a relationship so that those two can talk to each other. And behind the scenes, it will use this, but we don't need like an explicit model for it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my command line, and I'm going to say php artisan make model, and we're going to create that playlist model. We already have the track model, so let's create playlist now. Okay, so I'm going to start off with track. So so if I found a single track and I want to find out, what all the playlists that track belongs to, I can start off by saying public function playlists. So there's going to be many playlists from a single track. And then in here, I'm going to say return this arrow belongs to many. So this track will belong to many playlists. And then here we're going to say app/playlist. Now, if our database followed the conventions with like the foreign keys and primary keys, everything would be cool, and this was all we would have to do, and we could go to the corresponding playlist and do the exact same thing. So let's actually just do this now. So we'll say here, we'll say public function tracks. And we can say return this belongs to many app/track. So this was all we would have to do just to set up this relationship between the two if our database followed those primary key and foreign key conventions. But given that it isn't, actually while we're at it, let's copy these two columns or these two fields to the playlist because we didn't do this. So we need to tell it the primary key, which in this case it's playlist ID, and then we'll disable the timestamps. Okay, so we'll go back to the track class, and then to get the playlist, we need to tell it a little bit more information. So one of the things we have to tell it is what's the join table. So I can say it is playlist underscore track. And then we have to tell it the two keys in there. So in this case, I can say track ID and playlist ID, and these are the two columns in that playlist underscore track table. Like the default convention was actually this table does follow the default convention, but these foreign keys here they don't. So it actually expects playlist underscore ID and then track underscore ID, and obviously these would have ID. But yeah, this is cool, and that's cool.
Wait. So the join table is okay, which is
For the most part, it's the column names that are not okay. They should actually be called this to like follow the default conventions, but it's like playlist ID.
the table name.
The table name's cool, yeah. Yeah, and this is all in the doc, so like it's actually I put a link to the Eloquent docs. If you're just reading it, like you can find all this. It's pretty easy to find in there. Okay, so that's all we had to do for this right here to set up this relationship. Now we can go back to playlist, and right here, we essentially do the same thing. So we do playlist underscore track, say playlist ID, and then track ID. So if you notice, like between these two, I'll put these in like the two. They're pretty similar. The one difference here is it says, I think the order of these things matter. So in this case, like the third argument, see how it's like track ID, and this corresponds to the track class. So that one comes first. But then once you go to the playlist class, we're doing the playlist ID first and then track ID. So like just kind of be aware of that. The docs kind of explain it more, but this is roughly what it does. Okay, so that's just defining those methods. Now we have access to this join table. Like if we had to think about this, like writing pure SQL, we would have to do a lot more work to kind of query, and we'd have to query this and then join against these two tables and then re-alias the columns and all that, right? It gets a little bit more work. Whereas once we set up the relationships, now we can makes it easier to access in our code. Okay, so now I'm going to run PHP Artisan Tinker again. Okay, so I'm going to say use app/playlist. I'm going to say use app/track. Now let's find a couple playlists. So I'll say playlist. Let me just find the top 3. Oh yeah, so we didn't cover this, but instead of calling all, I can say take and then a number and then call get, kind of like the query builder. I can do that same thing, and this will just give me the top 3 playlists. Not top 3 as in like the most listened to, but like top 3 as in the top ones in the database. Okay, so let's look at, we'll just do music, so 1. So from here I can say playlist : find 1, and this will give us music. Now I can from here access all the tracks, and by just saying arrow tracks, and there's a lot of tracks I think for this music playlist. Okay, there might be too many. Let's pick a different one. It's a little hard to see here. Let's try, I think there was one called TV shows. Okay, if you change it to 3, so find 3. There's fewer, which makes it easier to see in the console. But here we can see, okay, we have a bunch of tracks, and if we look at the these sound like TV things, so we'll just take our word for it. But yeah. Okay, so we can access the tracks off a playlist. Now let's do another one. So we can say track : find. I think it was 78 for that Metallica one. Okay, so we can see, okay, which playlist does this one belong to? We can say grab it, and we'll say playlist. So I just did found the track and then arrow playlist, and then I can see it's part of the music playlist, 90s music, and I think there's multiple music playlists in our app. One has an ID of 1 and one has an ID of 8, but it's part of these 3 playlists. We can also find like a different one, so we could say, I don't know, track 5, whatever that is. So you can see, even just like us tinkering around in here, like the amount of code that we have to write just to query the database, it's not a whole lot. We just have to kind of tell it enough about the database so that it can figure out like the relationships and know how to query it. And it becomes even less code if you just follow the conventions, which are, just your foreign keys, call it singular _ ID, call your primary keys ID. Everything is lowercase. Table names are plural. Those are like the main conventions, I think. And then your join table. I know Laravel creates it by alphabetizing. They concatenate like the 2 table names, but the singular, so playlist _ track. But then it puts it in alphabetical order. So whatever track came first, so P is before T, then it does that _ track. So. But yeah, those are pretty much all the conventions. So makes it even less code than that we would have to write. Any questions? Yes.
I like to the playlist scroll the way.
Yeah. Make it a little smaller and then. Okay, so for the lab, so it's a little smaller, so I made it a lab instead of a full assignment. So if you click on this, this one's a little different. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna create a GitHub gist. Has anybody heard of those? A couple of you. Okay. So what it is I'll create one. So if I click on this link right here, so gist.github.com. Okay, so I'm like in an incognito window, but you can sign in and you can create like these little samples. And here, let me actually just go to my other account. Okay, so it's gist.github.com. Maybe it's gist. Yeah, okay. So it's gonna create this like little editor thing, and you can just create like little snippets, and it's really great for like putting code. So what you're gonna do is you're just gonna answer these 5 questions, and I just gave you a few queries to run against using Eloquent, and you're gonna okay, so you're gonna name your gist like this right here. So last name underscore first name, lab1, Eloquent. And I put in an example of what it should look like. So if you click this link right here, you can see an example like if this were just one question. You could say, okay, put the description here, and then the little snippet of code. So your model class, and then like what the query was, if there is a query. And so to write these like code blocks, what you can do inside the gist is, let's see, where is it? So if I were doing a gist in PHP, I can use these triple backticks. So I think I explained this. You can also do this in Slack, but you can do triple backticks. And then unlike Slack, in this gist, you can actually add like the language. So PHP, you could do this. For JavaScript, you can do that. For HTML, you can do this. And this will do like special syntax highlighting for that language. That part doesn't work in Slack, but in gist, it does. So you'll just do like PHP and then copy your code here and submit it that way. So name it exactly kind of like the format I said, and then just kind of create this markdown. This also gives you a chance to like learn markdown a little bit and put code snippets just because it's very handy. And then you'll just email us with a link to that gist. Yes.
The same database?
Yeah, same database.
Are there customers?
Yes. Over here. So I touched these tables over here, so now you'll touch these tables. Cool. So that lab is due next week, and then the project proposal, that's in a couple weeks. So you have some time to think about it. If you want to bounce ideas off me, we can. We can talk about it. Other than that, we'll end it for today, and see you next week.